crowd didn't start coming until the church bells started ringing, and they rang for about 10 minutes solid. It was beautiful, actually. But in the meantime, I got a few photos from inside. That's the baptismal font. Our interest was especially piqued when Pastor Ruth Kramer announced that 3 children would be baptized during the service that morning. We tried to imagine the similarities between the service we witnessed and the ones from centuries ago when our Showalter ancestors were the infants being baptized. It was the same old church building. Certainly some of the liturgy was the same. As the children were baptized with the words, Ich taufe dir im Namen Vaters und Sohn und Heiliger Geist, I baptize you in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. After the service, Pastor Ruth and her husband, also Pastor Bernhard, introduced us to Rudolf Hohl, and he's the one who devoted the rest of his day to us, showing us everything we could possibly want to know about the history of Zofingen and Strengelbach. Also recorded in the Zofingen church records were marriages. I have one more drawing of Zofingen. If you notice the spire in the very center, that's the church, 2 different roof lines. That's the church exactly how it is today. Now, since we're west-facing, Strengelbach would be maybe one of these places of settlement, or maybe the drawing was a little bit loose and you can't really know for sure. But also recorded in the church records were marriages. We know that Sylvester was married to Barbelin and then Anna. They were not in the marriage record because they were too early, but husband and wife were both named in the infant baptism records. But then we have Jacob I, married to one Anna and then another one. We have Jacob II, married to Margareta. Jacob III was married, but we don't know to whom because it's not registered. And you'll find out why a little bit later. But this Jacob III, we need to talk about him a little bit more. Before we do that, I want to go through our dial and ramp it up kind of quickly. All of these Sylvester, Jacob I, II, III, baptized at Zofingen, lived at Strengelbach. We get to the 3rd Jacob, and here we're going to take a little bit more time because he's a key figure in our history. He represents 2 major transitions: the conversion from Reformed Protestantism to Anabaptism, and he represents the immigration from Switzerland into the German Alsace region, which is in present-day France. As I mentioned, we don't know the name of his wife. Some have speculated that she might have been a Detweiler, since the Detweilers lived in Strengelbach alongside the Showalters. They also became Anabaptist about the same time, and they also moved to the same place in the Alsace. But that's not proof. The infant baptisms of Showalters become reduced, as we saw on the one slide, and after several more decades, the Showalters are no longer mentioned in either the baptism register or the marriage register at Zofingen. They just disappeared. And that would be the end of the story, except that at the very same time, not too surprisingly, I guess, they start popping up in a different part of the world. In the area right along the border between France and Germany. I don't have a map of that at this point, but I'll get to one. It's a distance of about 150 miles. That's a long distance for those days. Somebody could have almost driven here tonight 150 miles, though I'm not quite sure. And we'll talk about the trip north. Wonder if the Showalters left by their own choice, or were they forced to leave? Did they leave for religious reasons or economic reasons? And probably any combination of this is actually possible. Every generation has its challenges, but in Switzerland in the 1670s, it was an especially difficult time, especially difficult decade. Areas of instability included demographics, climate, agriculture, economics, politics, social unrest, religion. Is there anything else in a community's life that wasn't in turmoil at that time? The 30 Years' War was over. That was a good thing. The Swiss had not been in the war, which was mostly a French versus German conflict, but the Swiss farmers had strong markets during the war. And now that the war's over, the markets evaporated and the prices of farm products plunged. There were sudden and unexplainable climate changes. They'd have a few good growing seasons, followed by cold years, where the growing seasons were not long enough to harvest a decent crop. There's records that May and September were not growing months, and from June to August was barely long enough to get in much of a crop. Crop failure meant famine, and famine meant starvation. On top of that, the powerful city people manipulated the currency, the Bernese batzen, to their benefit and to the detriment of the farmers. Then the plague would come through, which even in small communities like Zofing and Stringelbach could take 100 lives in a single year, and then come back a few years later and do its deadly deed all over again. The peasants revolted. The peasants had many grievances against their rulers. One grievance was an unfair tax structure, which taxed all of a person's property, but didn't allow for their debts. This tax season was hard on the peasants or the farmers who may have owned a large property, but usually also had a large mortgage or debt on the property and didn't have much net worth. They still had to pay taxes as high as the wealthy people. There was a common understanding that these problems, especially the climate and the plague, were from God's punishing hand. Though, as one historian says, the misdemeanor was unclear. On the one hand, the rulers scapegoated the Anabaptists. The Anabaptists, the rulers said, had incited God's vengeful hand through their disrespect of the state church. And to make matters worse, the Anabaptists were increasing in number almost daily. That's the ruler's perspective. On the other hand, the rural population had an entirely different interpretation about God's punishing hand. To the rural people, God's punishment stemmed from the fact of how the authorities were mistreating God's people. And to the rural people, it was easy to identify God's people, just observe how they lived their lives. The horrible 1670s were followed by a good and easy, comfortable 1680s. Complacency set in. Lots of births, lots of mouths to feed. It turned out to be a bad setup for the following decade, the 1690s, which were just as bad or even worse than the 1670s. Hard times caused people to ask hard questions and to look for spiritual answers to their hard questions. Questions like, what is real? What is truth? What am I willing to live for? What am I willing to die for? And am I ready to die? How can I be certain of my salvation? What would God have me to do? For some, the answers to these questions were found in the faith of the Anabaptists. A compelling witness was also seen in the exemplary moral lives of many of the Anabaptists. And so, Jacob III embraced the faith of the Anabaptists. He asked for and received a second baptism. He had been baptized as an infant, as we've seen. This time he took an adult believer's baptism. The third Jacob and his family joined a group called, in German, the Wiedertäufer. We call them the Anabaptists, later to be known as Mennonites. The Anabaptists began in 1525, in the early years of the Protestant Reformation, in the city of Zurich. They formed a Christian fellowship based on voluntary membership, completely independent of state church control. They baptized upon confession of faith, rejected infant baptism. They stressed living in obedience to God's word. They rejected violence in all its forms, including military participation. Now, both the government and the church felt threatened by this movement, since it disrupted 1,000 years of tight connections between the government, the church, and the population. At first, the powers dealt with this Anabaptist threat by offering debates They believed we can convince them of the error of their ways. Debates between the Reformed leaders and the Anabaptists. One of the first of these debates took place, at all places, in Zofingen, kind of a small town to hold something that momentous, and yet it was kind of neutral territory, and it had the advantage of being almost halfway between the big cities of Zurich and Bern. I wonder if Hans Showalter was aware of the debate. Perhaps, but in the least, he would have been aware of the debate. He would have been aware of the issues involved. Now, at the end of the debate, the Reformed theologians were always declared to be the winners, even when many times the common people were certain that the Anabaptist leaders and teachers had presented a more convincing case. But if you declared yourself sympathetic to the Anabaptist, or even went all the way and received the baptism, that was a dangerous move. It would invite persecution, possibly to the point of death. The story of the Anabaptists from their start in 1525 through the late 1600s is a progression from evangelism and rapid growth, followed by severe persecution, and then on to tenuous survival. By the late 1600s again, and think about it in generations, this would be about 5 generations after Conrad Grebel and Felix Manz, the Anabaptists had been totally eradicated from the Swiss regions of Zurich and Schaffhausen by a combination of imprisonments, beheadings, drownings, and banishments. In the region of Bern, however, the persecution was just as intense, but the result was different. The Anabaptist movement survived in the Bernese regions, especially in the remote Oberland and Emmental valleys. In fact, in this time period, Bernese Anabaptism experienced a period of renewal and growth. It's been reported that more family names were added during this time period that have continued to the present time than any other period of Anabaptist Mennonite history. And so the Showalters were part of a large movement to Anabaptism at this particular place and at this particular time. The third Jakob joined the Anabaptists. Southwest Germany and northeast France had experienced near total devastation from the 30 Years' War. Decades later, large areas were still only sparsely populated and were not fully productive. Numerous estate owners sought out the Swiss Anabaptists to settle on their estates, since they had a reputation for being successful farmers, hardworking, and honest. But even a good reputation was not enough to gain the Anabaptists full rights in these German and French regions. They were allowed only to rent land and not own it. They were allowed to gather in groups of 20 or less. We would be illegal. They were not supposed to evangelize, not even their own children, though they did it anyway. They also had an obligation to pay taxes that others did not have to pay. So having escaped from severe persecution in Switzerland, the level of toleration for Anabaptists in France and Germany was only a little better, and even then it was carried out inconsistently. Nevertheless, a high-ranking government official made a ruling, and in it he stated the following: they, the Anabaptists, cleaned the land, put it back into productivity by clearing off the wild-growing brush. These people do not bother or hinder anyone, but live very peaceably. Getting ready to say goodbye to Stringelbach, one other more old house. In the center is the Swiss flag, the canton Aargau, the village Stringelbach. Each has its own flag. And one more entrance or exit to the city, and down the Rhine River. We are still at Jakob III. He joined the Anabaptists and left Switzerland. In the church records in Steinsalz in the Alsace, we find the Showalters living at a place called the Schafbusch. It is right on the northwest corner of France. It was many times over the history in German control. It's more of a German language, German culture.